In early February 2025, concern began to grow around Tammy King, a 61-year-old grandmother living in the coastal town of Bacliff, Texas. For several days, no one had been able to reach her. Calls went unanswered. Messages were never returned. For someone known to stay in regular contact with family, the silence stood out. There were no signs of forced entry, no reports of a disturbance, and no immediate indication that a crime had occurred. From the outside, her home appeared unchanged. Nothing suggested urgency. When deputies were finally asked to conduct a welfare check on February 6, 2025, what they discovered inside the house changed the case instantly. Tammy King was already dead, and had been for days. As investigators began reconstructing the timeline, it became clear that this was not a sudden tragedy, but a planned act that had gone unreported, concealed, and carried out by people far closer than anyone initially suspected. Tammy King was 61 years old at the time of her death. She lived in Bacliff, a small, unincorporated community in Galveston County, Texas, located near the Gulf Coast. The area is characterized by modest single-family homes, long-term residents, and a pace of life that tends to be quieter than in nearby urban centers like Houston. Tammy King had lived there for years and was a familiar presence within her immediate surroundings. By all available accounts, Tammy King's life followed a stable and predictable routine. She was a mother and a grandmother, roles that shaped much of her daily life and identity. Family connections were central to her routine, and she maintained regular contact with relatives. There is no indication in publicly available records that she lived an isolated or withdrawn life. On the contrary, her absence was noticed precisely because consistent communication was the norm. Her home in Bacliff was not transient or temporary. It was a fixed residence where she lived alone, but remained closely tied to her family. The house itself was unremarkable, typical of the neighborhood, without signs of unusual security measures or isolation. It did not stand apart visually from surrounding properties, nor did it suggest a need for heightened privacy. From the outside, it reflected stability rather than vulnerability. Tammy King's role within her family extended beyond formal titles. As a grandmother, she was involved in the lives of younger relatives. Family members later described regular interaction, both in person and through phone calls or messages. This pattern of contact would later become one of the earliest indicators that something was wrong when it abruptly stopped. There were no documented reports of ongoing disputes, threats, or conflicts involving Tammy King in the period leading up to her death. Law enforcement records and media reporting do not indicate any recent restraining orders, emergency calls, or domestic complaints linked to her address. This absence of documented conflict is significant because it shaped how her sudden silence was initially interpreted by those around her. In small communities like Bacliff, routine is often observable. Neighbors become accustomed to seeing familiar patterns. Lights turning on in the evening, vehicles coming and going. Small variations that still follow a recognizable rhythm. Tammy King's routine fit into that pattern. Nothing in her day-to-day life suggested that she was preparing to leave, that she felt threatened, or that she anticipated an abrupt change. Her relationships within the family were outwardly functional. While not every detail of private family dynamics is publicly known, there were no indications, at least from the outside, that suggested escalating tension or imminent danger. This outward normality would later contrast sharply with what investigators uncovered. Importantly, Tammy King's living situation meant that there were individuals who had legitimate access to her home. Family members knew the residence, the layout, and the routines. Access to the house did not require forced entry, and there was no reason, under ordinary circumstances, to restrict entry from close relatives. This fact would later play a critical role in how investigators assess the crime scene. Her financial life, as far as has been reported, did not raise immediate red flags. There were no public indications of financial distress, significant debt, or disputes over property at the time. The home did not appear abandoned, neglected, or under threat of foreclosure. These factors mattered because they influenced early assumptions about her disappearance. Tammy King's age also shaped expectations. At 61, she was not considered particularly vulnerable in the sense of being unable to care for herself. She was not reported to be suffering from conditions that would have made sudden disappearance likely or explainable. Her routine independence further reduced the likelihood that silence would immediately be interpreted as an emergency. Family members later stated that Tammy King was the type of person who would notify someone if she planned to travel or be away. She did not simply vanish without explanation. This established behavior became critical when attempts to reach her failed over multiple days. The absence of outward conflict also meant that early concern developed gradually rather than immediately. There was no single triggering event, no argument, no reported incident that prompted an urgent response. Instead, concern accumulated over time as the lack of contact persisted. This slow realization reflects how crimes occurring in familiar private spaces can remain undetected. When daily life appears unchanged, there is often no immediate reason to suspect the worst. Tammy King's home showed no visible disruption. Neighbors did not report unusual noise or activity. The house did not appear abandoned. These factors contributed to the delay before authorities were contacted. In retrospect, Tammy King's life in Bacliff represented a common and deeply ordinary reality. She was not a public figure, not involved in high-risk activities, and not known to associate with dangerous individuals outside her immediate circle. Her routines were domestic, her environment familiar, and her relationships grounded in family. This normality is essential to understanding how the case unfolded. The crime did not occur against a backdrop of chaos or instability. It occurred within a setting defined by routine, familiarity, and trust. That context would later sharpen the significance of what investigators discovered. When communication with Tammy King stopped, it did not immediately signal violence. It signaled absence. And in a life defined by consistency, that absence became the first and initially only indication that something was wrong. At this stage of the story, nothing pointed outward. There was no external suspect, no immediate evidence of intrusion, and no clear explanation for the silence. The answers, investigators would later learn, were not located somewhere beyond her community. They were rooted in the very relationships that had defined her life in Bacliff. Tammy King was last heard from in the final days of January 2025. The exact time of her last confirmed communication has not been publicly narrowed to a precise hour, but investigators and family members were able to establish that contact stopped abruptly and without explanation. For several days, calls went unanswered and messages remained unread. This break in communication stood in contrast to her established routine. Tammy King was known to stay in regular contact with her family. Phone calls, text messages, and informal check-ins were part of her everyday life. While she lived alone, she was not isolated. Family members later told investigators that silence of this length was unusual. However, the absence did not immediately trigger alarm. There was no single moment when concern escalated into urgency. In the early stages, attempts to reach her were casual rather than urgent. Missed calls were initially attributed to routine explanations. A phone left charging in another room, a dead battery, a busy day, or the possibility that she was resting or occupied. These assumptions were reasonable given her age, independence, and lack of known health emergencies. Importantly, there was no immediate external trigger that would have reframed the situation as an emergency. No neighbors reported unusual sounds. There were no visible disturbances at the home. Her vehicle was not immediately noted as missing. From the outside, her house appeared unchanged. Curtains, lights, and exterior conditions did not suggest anything out of the ordinary. This period of uncertainty extended over several days. During that time, concern developed gradually rather than sharply. Family members noticed the silence, but without a specific reason to believe she was in danger, they hesitated to involve authorities. In many cases, welfare checks are initiated when a specific fear arises. Here, fear accumulated slowly. The absence of a formal missing person report during this time was not the result of indifference. It reflected how disappearances within private domestic settings can go unrecognized when there are no immediate signs of distress. Tammy King had not expressed fear, had not indicated plans to leave town, and had not been involved in any known disputes that would have suggested imminent danger. As the days passed, the lack of response became harder to explain. Messages were sent and not acknowledged. Calls continued to go unanswered. At this point, concern shifted from mild to persistent. Family members began to consider possibilities beyond routine explanations, including illness or an accident inside the home. Despite this growing unease, there was still no evidence pointing clearly toward a crime. The situation remained ambiguous. Tammy King was not known to disappear without notice, but she was also not known to require constant supervision. This ambiguity delayed decisive action. The delay is significant, not because it represents a failure, but because it illustrates a common pattern in domestic cases. When individuals live alone and maintain predictable routines, deviations are often interpreted cautiously. Families hesitate to assume the worst without clear indicators. Another factor was access. Tammy King's home was familiar to family members. There was no immediate reason to believe she was unreachable because of an external threat. The house did not appear abandoned, and there were no reports of forced entry. These details reinforce the assumption that whatever had caused the silence was likely temporary. During this period, there is no public indication that Tammy King made contact with anyone outside her immediate family. No confirmed sightings were reported. No transactions or activities were publicly documented that would have suggested she was active elsewhere. The absence was complete, but it unfolded quietly. Eventually, the continued lack of response crossed a threshold. Family members decided that the silence could no longer be explained by routine circumstances. The concern shifted from uncertainty to the recognition that something was wrong, even if its nature was still unclear. At that point, authorities were contacted and asked to conduct a welfare check at her residence. This decision marked the first formal step in what would become a homicide investigation. Until then, the situation existed in a gray area between absence and emergency. The days before the welfare check are critical to understanding how the case unfolded. They explain why Tammy King was not reported missing immediately and why the crime remained undiscovered for several days. The delay was not caused by a lack of care or awareness, but by the absence of visible warning signs. From an investigative perspective, this period created challenges. Time passed between the death and discovery. That gap affected the condition of the scene and limited the ability to establish an exact timeline. However, it also provided insight into post-event behavior, particularly the absence of any effort to report the death. The silence itself became evidence. Investigators later examined when communication stopped and how that aligned with other known events. The lack of contact was not random. It represented a clear break from Tammy King's established behavior. At this stage, however, none of that was yet known. To her family and neighbors, Tammy King was simply unreachable. The house remained quiet. The neighborhood remained unchanged. Life continued around a space where something irreversible had already occurred. When deputies finally arrived to check on Tammy King's welfare, the uncertainty would end. What they found would immediately reframe the silence, not as absence, but as concealment. On February 6, 2025, concern surrounding Tammy King reached a point where family members decided to involve authorities. For several days, repeated attempts to contact her had failed. Phone calls went unanswered. Text messages were never opened. For someone who was known to maintain regular communication, the silence had become increasingly difficult to explain. Tammy King lived alone in her home in Bacliff, Texas, a small coastal community in Galveston County. She was not known to travel without informing family members, nor was she known to ignore contact for extended periods. The absence of any response over multiple days prompted relatives to request a welfare check through the Galveston County Sheriff's Office. Deputies arrived at the residence later that day. From the exterior, nothing appeared unusual. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. There were no visible disturbances in the yard or surrounding area. The neighborhood itself was quiet, with no reports of unusual activity or noise in the days prior. After announcing their presence, deputies entered the home to assess the situation. As they moved through the interior, it quickly became apparent that this was not a medical emergency or a welfare issue that could be resolved. In the bedroom, they discovered Tammy King deceased. Her body was located on or near the bed. Based on the initial observation, it was clear that death had not occurred recently. The condition of the body indicated that she had been dead for an extended period of time, consistent with the days of missed communication reported by family members. The deputies immediately secured the scene and notified supervisors. What had begun as a routine welfare check escalated into a potential criminal investigation within minutes. Standard protocol required that the area be treated as a crime scene until the circumstances of death could be determined. During the preliminary assessment, investigators observed gunshot wounds. These injuries ruled out natural causes or an accidental death. A medical examiner was contacted and later confirmed that the injuries were fatal and that the manner of death was homicide. Further medical evaluation supported the conclusion that Tammy King had died several days prior to her discovery. This timeline aligned with the point at which contact with her had ceased. The gap between the estimated time of death and the welfare check immediately raised questions about what had occurred during that period. As the scene was documented, investigators began to note the condition of the bedroom and adjacent areas. While there was no widespread destruction, parts of the home appeared disturbed. Some drawers were open. Certain areas suggested that items may have been searched for or removed. These observations were recorded but not interpreted at that stage. Importantly, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the residence. Doors and windows showed no damage. Locks appeared intact. This indicated that whoever had been inside the home after Tammy King's death likely had legitimate access or was known to her. The absence of forced entry significantly narrowed the scope of the investigation. Rather than pointing toward an unknown intruder, it suggested involvement by someone familiar with the house, its layout, and Tammy King's routines. Investigators also noted that the death had not been reported at the time it occurred. No emergency call had been placed. No attempt had been made to seek help. The delay in discovery was not due to isolation alone, but to the absence of any notification to authorities. This delay became a central focus. In cases involving natural death or accidental injury, it is common for someone to alert emergency services quickly. Here, the opposite had occurred. Tammy King's death had remained unreported while time passed. Forensic teams were called to process the scene. Evidence was documented, photographed, and collected. Investigators searched for shell casings, projectiles, or ballistic evidence that could provide insight into the weapon used. They also examined surfaces for signs of cleanup or tampering. The bedroom, where Tammy King was found, did not show signs of a prolonged struggle. Furniture was largely in place. There were no overturned items that would suggest a chaotic confrontation. This absence of disorder suggested that the shooting may have occurred in a controlled manner, rather than during an extended altercation. As investigators worked through the house, they continued to document areas that appeared inconsistent with ordinary daily activity. While the home did not appear ransacked in a dramatic sense, there were enough irregularities to suggest purposeful actions taken after the death. The lack of forced entry, combined with the state of the home, reinforced the working theory that the crime involved someone with familiarity and access. This conclusion was based on physical evidence rather than assumption. By the end of the initial response, authorities formally classified Tammy King's death as a homicide. This determination was based on the gunshot wounds, the estimated time of death, and the circumstances surrounding the delayed discovery. Once the case was classified as a homicide, responsibility shifted to homicide investigators. The focus moved from assessing welfare to reconstructing events, identifying who had last seen Tammy King alive, and determining who had access to her home during the critical time frame. Family members were notified of her death later that day. For them, the period of uncertainty ended abruptly, replaced by confirmation of a violent crime. At the same time, investigators began asking questions about Tammy King's recent interactions, visitors, and relationships. The discovery on February 6, 2025, marked the definitive turning point in the case. The unanswered calls and messages were no longer just unexplained silence. They were evidence of a crime that had occurred behind closed doors and remained hidden for days. What investigators uncovered inside the house made one thing clear. Tammy King's death was not sudden, accidental, or immediately reported. It was a homicide that had gone unnoticed, unreported, and concealed within a familiar domestic setting. From that moment forward, the investigation would focus not on strangers or random acts, but on those who had proximity, access, and opportunity, and on how a violent act inside a quiet home had remained undiscovered for as long as it did. On the day Tammy King's body was discovered, investigators began a detailed examination of the interior of her home in Bacliff, Texas. The purpose was not only to document the immediate surroundings of where she was found, but to understand what had happened inside the house in the days before authorities arrived. The overall condition of the home did not suggest chaos or a violent struggle that had spiraled out of control. Furniture was largely in place. Rooms were recognizable and intact. There were no overturned tables, broken doors, or shattered windows that would typically indicate a forced confrontation. This initial impression was important because it immediately separated the scene from cases involving sudden break-ins or random acts of violence. At the same time, the house did not appear untouched. As investigators moved room by room, they noted areas that appeared disturbed in a way that did not align with ordinary daily activity. Drawers in certain rooms were open. Storage areas appeared to have been searched. These observations were subtle rather than dramatic, but they were consistent enough to warrant careful documentation. The distinction mattered. A house can be lived in without being orderly, but investigators are trained to look for patterns that suggest purposeful searching. In this case, the open drawers and altered storage areas were not random. They appeared selective, as though someone had been looking for specific items rather than simply moving through the home aimlessly. As the examination continued, investigators began identifying missing property. According to law enforcement statements and later court filings, items believed to be missing included cash and firearms that Tammy King was known to keep in the home. These were not objects that could be easily misplaced or overlooked. Their absence suggested removal rather than loss. The potential theft of these items was significant for two reasons. First, it provided a possible motive connected to the crime. Second, it affected the legal classification of the case. In Texas, a homicide committed in connection with another felony, such as robbery, can elevate the charge to capital murder. At this stage, investigators were not assigning charges, but they were documenting facts that would later become central to prosecution decisions. Despite the signs of searching and missing items, investigators found no evidence of forced entry anywhere in the house. Doors were intact. Locks showed no damage. Windows were unbroken. There were no pry marks, splintered frames, or other indicators that someone had entered the residence against resistance. This absence of forced entry immediately narrowed the investigative focus. It suggested that whoever entered the home did so with ease, that access could have come from a key, prior permission, or familiarity with the residence. This finding made a random intruder less likely and directed attention toward individuals who were known to Tammy King and had legitimate access to her home. The layout of the house further supported this interpretation. Moving through the interior required familiarity. The areas that appeared searched were not the most obvious or immediately visible upon entry. This suggested that the person or persons inside the house knew where items of value were likely to be kept. Investigators also considered the timeline. Tammy King had been dead for several days before the welfare check. During that period, the house remained undisturbed from the outside. Neighbors did not report suspicious activity. There was no evidence that strangers had been coming and going. The lack of external attention reinforced the conclusion that the activity inside the home had not drawn notice. Medical findings played a critical role in shaping the understanding of what occurred inside the house. The medical examiner confirmed that Tammy King died from gunshot wounds. The injuries were fatal and ruled out accidental discharge or self-inflicted harm based on their nature and context. The gunshot wounds also aligned with the absence of a prolonged struggle. Firearm injuries can cause immediate incapacitation, reducing the likelihood of extended movement or disturbance within a room. This helped explain why the bedroom did not show signs of widespread disorder, despite the violent nature of the act. For investigators, the combination of a controlled scene, fatal gunshot wounds, and evidence of searching suggested a sequence of events rather than a spontaneous act. The working understanding became that Tammy King was shot inside her home and that subsequent actions were taken afterward, including searching the house and removing items. The timing of those actions was also significant. Because the death was not reported, there was an extended window during which the house could be accessed without scrutiny. This raised questions about who had been inside during that period and for what purpose. Forensic teams examined surfaces for signs of cleaning or attempts to remove evidence. While no extensive cleanup was immediately apparent, investigators remained cautious. Even minimal efforts to alter a scene can affect what evidence remains detectable days later. Ballistic evidence was also considered. Investigators searched for shell casings, projectiles, or fragments that could help identify the type of firearm used. The presence or absence of such evidence would later be evaluated alongside other findings. The fact that firearms were believed to be missing from the home introduced an additional complexity. If a weapon used in the shooting had been removed, it would explain the absence of obvious ballistic evidence at the scene. This possibility was documented rather than assumed. Throughout the examination, investigators maintained a distinction between observation and interpretation. They recorded what they saw without immediately assigning motive or responsibility. This discipline is essential in homicide investigations, particularly when the scene does not present a clear narrative on its own. The condition of the house also influenced how investigators approached interviews. Knowing that there was no forced entry and that items appeared to have been selectively removed, they prioritized individuals with close ties to Tammy King. The physical evidence pointed inward, toward familiarity and access, rather than outward toward an unknown offender. The lack of disturbance at entry points also ruled out certain timelines. If someone had broken in after her death, damage would likely have been visible. The intact condition of the house suggested that any access occurred in a manner consistent with everyday use. Taken together, the evidence inside the house established several key facts. Tammy King was killed by gunshot wounds inside her home. Her death occurred days before discovery. The house showed signs of searching, and items of value were missing. There was no forced entry. Each of these facts on its own might have allowed for multiple interpretations. Combined, they formed a coherent direction for the investigation. The crime did not resemble a random burglary gone wrong. It did not resemble an accident or a medical event. It pointed toward a deliberate act carried out by someone who knew the environment and had time to act without interruption. This evidentiary foundation shaped every step that followed. It determined who investigators focused on, what questions they asked, and how the case would eventually be charged. The house itself did not provide a full story, but it provided boundaries. It ruled out certain possibilities and made others far more likely. By the time investigators completed their initial assessment of the residence, the direction of the case was clear. The answers would not be found outside the home or among strangers. They would be found by examining relationships, access, and actions taken after Tammy King's death. The physical evidence inside the house did not tell investigators who was responsible, but it told them where to look. As investigators assessed the physical evidence inside the home, their attention shifted decisively toward Tammy King's immediate personal environment. The lack of forced entry, combined with signs of searching and missing items, made it clear that the crime was unlikely to involve a stranger. From this point forward, the investigation focused on the people who had direct access to the house and knowledge of Tammy King's routines. That focus quickly narrowed to Tara King, Tammy King's teenage granddaughter, and her boyfriend Uriah Lee Urick Jr. Both had regular access to the residence and were familiar with the layout of the home. Investigators established that they had been in contact with Tammy King in the period leading up to her death, and that they were among the last people known to have interacted with her. As part of the investigation, authorities began examining digital communications associated with both individuals. Phone records, messaging applications, and stored conversations were reviewed to reconstruct interactions before and after the estimated time of death. What investigators uncovered became central to the case. According to court filings and statements presented by prosecutors, investigators recovered digital messages exchanged between Tara King and Uriah Urick that predated Tammy King's death. These communications were not vague or incidental. They included discussions about killing Tammy King, timing the act, and what would happen afterward. The messages suggested that the crime was planned weeks in advance, rather than being the result of a sudden confrontation. The content of these messages indicated a shared intent. Investigators documented references to specific actions, anticipated outcomes, and future plans following the death. The tone and substance of the communications supported the conclusion that both individuals were aware of what was being discussed and participated in those discussions. Prosecutors later argued that the motive for the killing involved financial gain. According to the indictment and supporting evidence, the suspects believed Tammy King had cash and firearms in her home. Messages referenced the expectation that these items could be taken after the killing. There were also references to obtaining money for drugs, including methamphetamine, which investigators cited as part of the alleged motive. These communications were critical because they provided evidence of intent and planning independent of the physical crime scene. They allowed investigators to establish a timeline that extended backward from the date of death and forward into the period after the killing. The messages demonstrated that the crime was not impulsive and that it involved preparation. Investigators also examined financial records. According to law enforcement statements, there were indications that money had been transferred or accessed following Tammy King's death. While financial activity alone does not establish guilt, it provided additional context when considered alongside the missing cash and the digital communications. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned that Tara King and Uriah Urick were no longer in the area. This absence became significant. Investigators determined that the pair had left Bacliff shortly after the estimated time of death and were traveling together. Law enforcement agencies coordinated to locate them. Their movements were tracked through a combination of digital data, witness information, and investigative leads. This effort culminated on February 9th, 2025, when both were located in Laredo, Texas, several hundred miles from Bacliff. The arrests were carried out without incident. Tara King and Uriah Urick were taken into custody and transported back to Galveston County. At the time of their arrest, authorities noted efforts to alter their appearance, which investigators interpreted as an attempt to avoid recognition. This observation was documented as part of the case record. Following the arrests, prosecutors formally charged both individuals with capital murder. In Texas, this charge applies when a murder is committed under specific aggravating circumstances, including during the commission of another felony, such as robbery. The alleged theft of cash and firearms from Tammy King's home became legally significant at this stage. As investigators continued to examine the aftermath of the crime, they identified the involvement of a third individual, Travis Hodge. According to law enforcement statements, Hodge was alleged to have assisted Tara King and Uriah Urick after the killing. This assistance included helping them evade law enforcement and potentially aiding in the concealment or handling of evidence. Travis Hodge was later arrested and charged with offenses related to hindering apprehension and unlawful possession of a firearm. Prosecutors alleged that his actions occurred after the homicide and were intended to help the primary suspects avoid detection or arrest. His role was treated separately from the planning and execution of the killing itself. The identification of Hodge's involvement reinforced the investigative conclusion that the crime did not end with Tammy King's death. Actions continued in the days that followed, including movement away from the crime scene and efforts to avoid law enforcement. These post-crime actions became part of the broader evidentiary picture. Throughout this phase of the investigation, authorities maintained a clear distinction between what could be proven and what remained under review. Digital messages were treated as direct evidence of planning. Travel records and arrest locations established flight. Financial and property-related evidence supported the robbery component of the charge. The convergence of these elements, planning, motive, and flight, marked a turning point. The case moved from a homicide with unknown suspects to a prosecution built around documented intent and coordinated action. By the time formal charges were filed, investigators had established a coherent sequence. Communications discussing the killing, the death itself, the removal of items from the home, departure from the area, and eventual arrest. Each step was supported by records rather than inference. The arrests on February 9, 2025, effectively ended the search phase of the investigation. From that point forward, the focus shifted toward preparing the case for court. Prosecutors began organizing the digital evidence, forensic findings, and witness testimony that would be used to support the charges. What investigators uncovered during this phase would later form the backbone of the prosecution's case. The planning demonstrated intent. The flight demonstrated consciousness of guilt. And the arrests confirmed that the individuals under suspicion were no longer simply part of the victim's environment, but central figures in the crime itself. The final stage of the case would take place in court, where this evidence would be tested, challenged, and ultimately evaluated within the legal system. With the arrest completed and the investigative phase concluded, the case entered the judicial system under Texas law. Prosecutors formally charged Uriah Lee Urick Jr. and Tara King with capital murder, the most serious homicide charge available in the state. The charge reflected the prosecution's position that Tammy King had been killed during the commission of another felony, specifically robbery, based on evidence that cash and firearms were taken from the home after the shooting. Under Texas statutes, capital murder carries a limited range of penalties. For adult defendants, a conviction can result in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, or in some cases, the death penalty. For juvenile defendants, the death penalty is not applicable, but life without parole remains a possible outcome depending on circumstances and judicial discretion. These legal parameters framed every stage of the proceedings that followed. The case against Uriah Lee Urick Jr. moved forward first. As an adult defendant at the time of charging, his case was scheduled for a jury trial in Galveston County. Prosecutors structured their case around a combination of physical evidence, digital communications, and post-crime behavior. Rather than relying on eyewitness testimony, which was absent, the state focused on establishing intent and participation through records and documented actions. During pre-trial proceedings, the court addressed motions related to evidence admissibility. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the digital evidence, including message records and timelines, arguing potential issues with interpretation and context. Prosecutors countered by presenting authentication records and expert explanations of how the data had been obtained and preserved. The court ultimately allowed the evidence to be presented to the jury. At trial, prosecutors outlined a chronological narrative beginning with the planning phase. Jurors were shown message exchanges between Urick and Tara King that predated Tammy King's death. These communications were presented as evidence of premeditation, detailing discussions about killing Tammy King and accessing money and weapons afterward. The prosecution emphasized that these messages were not isolated statements, but part of a sustained exchange over time. The state then presented evidence related to the crime scene. Testimony from investigators and forensic personnel described the condition of the house, the absence of forced entry, and the items believed to be missing. Medical testimony confirmed that Tammy King died from gunshot wounds and that the manner of death was homicide. The estimated time of death was aligned with the period during which communication with her ceased. Prosecutors also addressed the issue of flight. Evidence showed that Urick and Tara King left the Bacliff area shortly after the estimated time of death and were later located in Laredo, Texas. The prosecution argued that this movement, combined with efforts to alter appearance, demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Defense counsel contested this interpretation, suggesting alternative explanations for travel, but the prosecution emphasized the timing and context. Throughout the trial, the state avoided speculative arguments. Instead, it relied on documented facts: messages sent, items missing, movements recorded, and actions taken after the death. The cumulative effect of this evidence was intended to show not only that a homicide occurred, but that Urick participated knowingly and intentionally. After hearing testimony and reviewing exhibits, the jury deliberated. In November 2025, the jury returned a verdict finding Uriah Lee Urick Jr. guilty of capital murder. The verdict reflected the jury's acceptance of the prosecution's argument that the killing was planned and committed in connection with another felony. Following the guilty verdict, the court proceeded to sentencing. Under Texas law, the conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was imposed accordingly. With sentencing complete, Urick was transferred into the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System to serve the remainder of his life in custody. The legal proceedings against Tara King followed a different path. As a juvenile defendant, her case involved additional considerations related to age and procedure. Rather than proceeding to a full jury trial, Tara King ultimately entered a guilty plea. In January 2026, Tara King formally pleaded guilty to capital murder. The plea eliminated the need for a trial and resulted in a direct sentencing phase. The court accepted the plea after confirming that it was entered knowingly and voluntarily. As with Urick, the sentence imposed reflected the seriousness of the charge. Tara King received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, consistent with Texas law governing capital murder convictions. The outcome underscored the court's determination that her age didn't negate her responsibility for participation in a planned homicide. Together, the verdict and plea concluded the criminal cases against the two primary defendants. With both receiving life sentences, the judicial process reached a final resolution regarding accountability for Tammy King's death. The case also included legal consequences for a third individual, Travis Hodge, who was charged separately with offenses related to assisting the defendants after the crime. These charges did not allege participation in the homicide itself, but focused on post-crime conduct, including hindering apprehension and firearm-related violations. His case proceeded independently from the capital murder prosecutions. From a legal perspective, the Tammy King case illustrates how capital murder statutes are applied in Texas when a homicide is connected to another felony. The robbery component, supported by evidence of missing cash and weapons, elevated the charge and influenced sentencing outcomes. Equally significant was the role of digital evidence. Messages exchanged before the crime became central to establishing premeditation and shared intent. In the absence of eyewitnesses or immediate reporting, these communications provided a detailed record of planning that could be examined, authenticated, and presented in court. The case demonstrates how modern homicide prosecutions increasingly rely on digital records to reconstruct intent and sequence. Text messages, travel data, and financial activity can collectively establish a narrative that does not depend on confession or direct observation. In this case, those records bridge the gap between physical evidence and legal responsibility. The legal outcome also reflects the court's treatment of crimes occurring within families. The fact that the victim was a grandmother and the defendants were members of her immediate family did not alter the application of the law. The charges and sentences reflected the acts committed, not the relationships involved. With sentencing complete, the case moved from the courtroom into the record books. Tammy King's death was no longer an unresolved homicide, but a closed case defined by judicial findings. The legal system's role was not to answer every question about motive or emotion, but to determine accountability based on evidence. In the end, the Tammy King case stands as an example of how planned violence within a domestic setting can remain hidden until uncovered by routine intervention, and how digital communication can become decisive in establishing intent. The verdicts close the criminal chapter of the case, marking the final legal consequences for actions that began quietly and ended with irreversible outcomes.